Jill.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. Today we are starting on the topic of forecasting, and we have with us Ms. Sue Grant. Ms. Grant, I'm just going to go through a bit of your background with the Commissioner. Your CV has been provided, and it's in tab 1 at the materials we've given you, and it's CAN 185936. You have a Bachelor of Science in Marine Biology from McGill?
Yes.
And a Master of Science in Environmental Biology and Ecology from the University of Alberta?
Yes, that's correct.
And you're presently doing graduate work in quantitative methods and fisheries management?
Yes. It's part of a diploma, select courses.
Okay, and that's at Simon Fraser University?
Yes.
And at Simon Fraser, you're working with Dr. Randall Peterman on some courses?
No, it's a variety of professors that I've taken individual courses with to upgrade my analytical skills or to keep them fresh.
Right, but one of them is Dr. Randall Peterman?
That's correct.
Okay. And you're currently the program head for sockeye and pink analytical at Fraser Stock Assessment, is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, and you've been in that position since 2008?
Yes.
And prior to that, you were the acting program head for sockeye, pink, chum, and creel at Fraser Stock Assessment.
Yes.
And you were there in that position for about 4 years.
Yes.
Thank you. I'd like to have the CV marked as the next exhibit, please.
Exhibit number 350.
Now, we've asked you to come here today to talk about preseason forecasting. As the program head for sockeye and pink analytical programs, you are in charge of generating the run size forecasts for Fraser River sockeye salmon, is that right?
That's correct.
And for what stocks are run size forecasts developed?
There's a total of 19 forecasted stocks, and these forecasted stocks are rolled up into a total of 4 run timing groups based on when they enter the Fraser watershed. So the first run timing group to enter the Fraser watershed is the early Stewart run, and that includes the early Stewart stock. The second run timing group to enter the Fraser watershed is the early summer run, and that's comprised of 8 stocks. That includes Bowron. Would you like?
No, the 8 is
that
fine.
detail is
Yep.
not required. So there's 8 stocks with the early summer run. There's 4 stocks associated with the summer run timing group, and 6 stocks associated with the late run timing stock group. And in addition to the 19 forecasted stocks, there's a number of miscellaneous stocks, a number of miscellaneous populations that are also forecasted.
Okay, and we have heard about CUs in the Fraser sockeye system. These 19 stocks, are they related to the CUs that we've heard about in the Fraser system?
There's overlap between the conservation units that have been identified. So in some cases, there's a direct relationship between the forecasted stocks and the conservation units. And in other cases, one stock might be comprised of multiple conservation units, and in other cases, there might be multiple stocks that are comprised of one conservation unit. So there's a little difference between conservation units and stocks.
Okay. And why do you use these 19 stocks then when you're doing your modeling?
The 19 stocks encompass the bulk of Fraser sockeye abundance within the Fraser watershed, and including the miscellaneous stocks. So the 19 forecasted stocks comprise 95 to 98% of the total abundance in the Fraser watershed, and the miscellaneous stocks comprise a significantly smaller component of the total abundance. But the forecasted stocks represent the bulk of the abundance of Fraser sockeye in the watershed.
Is there data available for those 19 stocks that allow you to use them in your modeling?
Yes, the 19 forecasted stocks have both stock and recruitment data associated with them. And what I mean by stock and recruitment is stock is what we use as effective female spawner abundance, which is female spawner abundance and their spawner success, so how successful they were in spawning in terms of their egg contribution. And in addition to stock, the recruitment component of the data set we use is catch plus escapement. So that's the core data we use for the 19 forecasted stocks.
And you mentioned that you do forecasts for the miscellaneous stocks where there's no recruitment data. Is that fair?
That's correct.
Okay, you just use a different method?
The miscellaneous stocks have only escapement data associated with them. So instead of paired stock recruitment data for the 19 forecasted stocks, the miscellaneous stocks only have escapement data associated with that. And what I mean by that is effective female spawner abundance data is what we specifically use. So there isn't a paired recruitment time series associated with that small number of miscellaneous stocks.
And sorry. Why do you not have the recruitment data for the small stocks?
These are very small stocks for the most part. So for example, the late run miscellaneous group is called the miscellaneous non-Shuswap group, and it's comprised of small populations within the Fraser watershed that these populations rear in Harrison Lake, and they're very small populations that would be because they're so small, it would be really hard to pick them up in fisheries that are breaking catch composition into the individual stock components. So for the miscellaneous runs, they're miscellaneous stocks not associated with a broader stock that cannot be teased apart within the catch composition. So we can't establish a recruitment time series for them.
And when you're doing the preseason forecast, you're working with a computer model, inputting data into that model. That's the basic concept, is that right?
Yes, there'd be a variety of models that we would use.
Okay, but it's a mathematical kind of model that you put the data into?
That's correct.
Okay, and what data is used? What data is entered into those models, the variety of models, to allow you to do the work? And if there's a different types of models, you could maybe just establish the broad categories of types of models.
Okay. There are two categories of models that we use in the forecasting process. The first type of model is called a biological model, and these models incorporate what I'd mentioned earlier, the stock and recruitment time series. And the biological models establish a relationship between the spawner abundance and the recruits, the resultant recruits. And so the core data that would go into these models, for example, a classic biological model would be the Ricker model, which is one that's probably come up in previous testimonies. And for clarification, would you want a lot of detail on?
Just the types of data that would be used in that kind of biological model.
Okay. So for some of these biological models that we use, such as the Ricker model is one of the models, would be the core data is, as I mentioned earlier, paired stock and recruitment data. So that's escapement data as well as catch plus escapement data, so it's paired. And that's fundamental to the models. Escapement is being used as a predictor variable in the models, but we have a number of stocks where we also have juvenile data. And for these stocks, there are some cases where we may use juvenile data as predictor variables as opposed to escapement data, because it eliminates some of the uncertainty in survival in the freshwater environment. So it gets us one step closer to the returning fish. So in some cases where we have juvenile data, we'll use that. We also use JAC data for one model in particular, that's Cultus. JAC data is generally not available at the time of forecasting because it's from the year that the year just before the forecast is being generated. But in some cases we do have JAC data. And then the other piece of data that we use for the 19 forecasted stocks in terms of biological models is also environmental variables. So specifically for biological models, we can also incorporate environmental variables into the models. And these include things like sea surface temperature, Fraser discharge, etc. In terms of the naive models,
Sorry, so that describes the biological models, and then is there another type of model that you use?
yes, the other broad type of model that we use has historically we've called them naive models, because these models don't establish any relationship between the spawning abundance and the resultant recruits, but instead are forecasting abundance based on summarizing the time series data that we have. So, for example, one example of a naive model would be a time series average model, what we call a TSA in short form. You'll see them on the forecast tables. The TSA model, or time series average model, would just average the returns over the historical time series and use that average to predict what we would see next year. So next year's return would simply be the average of the historical time series. So that's one example of a naive model. In the 2010 forecast, we've added a couple of models that include brood year escapement multiplied by recent productivities. So they're also using recruits per spawner, like average recruits per spawner productivity in recent years, multiplied by the brood year escapement. And those models are now using a predictor variable, brood year escapement. So that's why we've changed the name from naive models to non-parametric models, because we're not doing any parameter estimation like we are in the biological models, but we are using a predictor variable. So that's the core, for the 19 forecasted stocks, those would be the core models and the data inputs.
All right, and is the data that's available to you sufficient for running these models to predict the run size forecast, or to create the run size forecasts?
The stock recruitment data that we use for Fraser sockeye is globally accepted as being amongst the best stock recruitment time series for salmonids. So that's throughout the world. So we're starting off with a very good stock recruitment time series. So from that perspective, we have a good time series for stock recruitment data. The key pieces of information that we probably require more information, more research on, is the survival part of the whole stock recruitment relationship, understanding what are the mechanisms driving survival for Fraser sockeye. And this would include research in the freshwater environment and the marine environment. A lot of this is ongoing, and it is part of both within the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, as well as external groups and universities are continually conducting research and updating our knowledge on survival information for Fraser sockeye and salmonids in general within the Fraser watershed. However, that still is a missing element to improvements to the forecasting process, is getting even more information and understanding what the survival mechanisms are for Fraser sockeye.
You indicated that in the biological models you have some juvenile data for some stocks that helps you. Do you have juvenile data on all stocks?
No, we have. I'll start with just starting with just the core stock that has the longest time series of smolt data. Smolt data is, in terms of juvenile data, it's the furthest along within the freshwater life cycles. So you can have fry data that occurs within the freshwater environment while they're still within the lake. We can have fry data from hydroacoustic surveys, fry data from different trap projects. So there's several populations where we have all this fry information, and we can use that within the forecasting process, this early juvenile life history data. But the even better juvenile data is smolt data, because it's further along in the life history in the freshwater environment. So if we forecast with smolt data, we are eliminating all the uncertainty in survival in the freshwater environment. So we don't have to predict anymore what kind of mortality is going on in the freshwater environment as we do for stocks that don't have smolt data. So if we're just forecasting with adult spawners that return to the spawning ground, we're forecasting the future based on all the uncertainty we have with freshwater survival as well as marine. When we have smolt data, we're eliminating that uncertainty. We know we have a better starting point because we're further ahead in the life history. And now we just have uncertainty from the moment they leave the system that they're being measured in, the downstream migration, and then the ocean life history phase, that survival uncertainty. So the one stock where we have a really long time series for smolt data is Chilco. And Chilco is an indicator system for Fraser sockeye. It's the one stock where we have a really long time series of smolt data and also adult return data. So what we can do with that stock is partition total survival into freshwater survival and marine. So when we have annual events or we're looking at what's going on overall in Fraser sockeye survival, we look to Chilco to give us an indication of where is this, say for example 2009, that was a really an event where survival was extremely poor. You can look to Chilco to give you some indication of where that mortality occurred, to start narrowing down the questions that you're asking on what occurred in 2009. So Chilco is our indicator stock that we go to because we can look at what freshwater survival was like and marine survival and see where that occurred. Chilco is our only indicator stock for Fraser sockeye with that long time series of smolt data. We also have Cultus where we have smolt data, but Cultus is a unique stock in its own rights. The time series is very, it's not a complete time series through time. There's a lot of missing years, and it is not an indicator stock per se. So Chilco's our only indicator stock, and back to your question, Wendy, is that in a perfect world, it would be better to have more indicator stock data to give us a better handle on more than one stock in regards to being able to figure out if there's a survival breakdown, where is that occurring in the freshwater or the marine environment. And Chilco is one stock out of 19 telling us part of the story, but you'd probably want a few more indicator stocks to give you an idea of is this globally across all sites. So from an indicator stock perspective, in a world of unlimited resources, it would be beneficial to have more indicator stocks. And but we do have other juvenile data, like as I mentioned, fry data, that is useful for providing us with some indication of whether freshwater survival trends are tracking in other stocks. It's just not the smolt to the end of the freshwater life history phase.
Okay. Thank you. You talked a little bit about uncertainties in that answer, so I wanted to move to the next question, which is on that topic. What are some of I take it, first of all, that there are uncertainties in run size forecasting.
Yes.
What are some of those uncertainties? Can you describe them in general terms?
Yes. With any model, in the world of modeling, whether you're forecasting Fraser sockeye or you're forecasting the weather or global climate change, there's always going to be uncertainty in regards to your observations that you're using to seed the model. So, for example, for Fraser sockeye, we use escapement data as well as recruitment data as our core data. And there's always some uncertainty around those escapement estimates. You never have a perfectly accurate estimate, except in a few cases where we have fences and you're assessing the system with 100% accuracy. You're counting every single fish that goes through, so you know that it's 100% precise. It's a perfect system. But a lot of the escapement enumeration programs don't employ fences because they can't. It's usually a barrier to placing a fence on a lot of the systems because of water levels, flows, etc. So they use a range of methods to enumerate on the spawning grounds, from mark recapture studies or visual surveys from helicopter flights, etc. And there's going to be uncertainty in the core data we're using from that perspective. The same with that's the escapement data, but the same with the recruitment data. which is catch plus escapement, you'll have the escapement uncertainty as well as uncertainty in the catch estimates, because catch is assigned to the different stocks through assessing catch and doing some analysis on the animals being caught in the fisheries and assigning them based on a sample to the different stocks. So there can be uncertainty in that as well. So that's just classic observation error in the models. And the other kind of error in the models is or uncertainty in the models is associated with uncertainty and variability in interannual survival. So we use different models to explain recruitment, so brood year escapement, environmental variables, but there's always going to be a certain component of that interannual variation in survival that we cannot explain. And that is also a component of uncertainty in the models, the variation in recruitment over time. And the model forms themselves are part of the uncertainty, given you're exploring a lot of different forms of models that are capturing stock recruitment dynamics in different ways, so there's uncertainty in the model form that you're using as well. So I would say those would be the key uncertainty elements to the forecasts.
Survival, is that an uncertainty that comes into play as well, or is that captured in something you've already described?
Yes, it was captured in that we explain a lot of the variability in the stock recruitment, or we can explain a portion of the variability in what we see every year in terms of recruitment from a certain spawner abundance, but there's a certain component of that's unexplained. So there's uncertainty in future survivals for Fraser sockeye.
Okay. So that could be uncertainties about what happens in the marine environment, uncertainties about what happened in the freshwater environment, that kind of thing?
That's right.
Okay. All right, thank you. So that's very helpful background. I want to look at the models that are being used, and I know that there's been a change made to the model in 2010. So I think to just put that in context, we'll look first at the 2009, or how forecasting was done prior to 2010, and then move into the 2010 changes. So the first place I want to go is to the paper prepared by Al Cass, Michael Folks, and others, which is a science advisory secretariat document prepared in 2006, and that's in tab 2 of your binder in front of you, and it's CAN 002926, and it's called Pre-Season Run Size Forecast for Fraser River Sockeye for 2006. You got that? Okay.
Yes.
Are you familiar with that paper?
Yes.
Okay. Now, as I understand it, this document basically outlines the models that were used to develop the forecast for 2006 and up until, and probably including 2010 to some extent. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. If you turn to page 2 and 3 of that document, page 3 and 4 describe these two broad-based model descriptors, naive models and biological models that you reviewed earlier. Okay. And section 3, which is on page 2, describes the methodology, and it says that there's these 3 steps. First, you choose the candidate forecast model depending on data availability. Second, perform a retrospective analysis for each stock. 3, evaluate model performance by comparing the retrospective forecast with the abundance observed. And then 4, identify the best forecast model and present forecasts as posterior distributions of returns. So I just want to go through those methods. I just first say that's still the method that was used up until 2010?
That's correct.
And I'll come to 2010 later, because I understand that this was still part of what was done in 2010 in any event.
Yeah, that's
okay.
correct.
But I'll come to 2010 in a minute. Okay, so if you can just explain, what does that mean, the first step in the method, to choose the candidate forecast model depending on data availability? What is involved in that step?
We have a suite of models that we have in our toolkit of models that we use for forecasting. So it's a range of biological models and naive models. And Particularly for the biological models, we can, as we talked about earlier, typically we use stock recruitment data for the 19 forecasted stocks, and that's escapement and recruitment data. For some stocks, we have juvenile data. So what this first point is pointing out that we would also explore the adult escapement data with the recruitment data for the biological models. But if there is juvenile data associated with it, we'd layer on the juveniles, using the juvenile data as predictor variables. So, and that can't be done for all stocks because not all stocks have juvenile data. So there are some stocks that we can incorporate juvenile data into. The same with JAC data. JAC data generally doesn't come in, we don't have it available in time for the forecasting process. Cultus is one stock where we do have JAC data available because it's a fence and we get that data in season, so we use JAC data for Cultus specifically. And environmental variables can be used for the forecasted stocks. The 19 forecasted stocks, when we're using biological models, can be included as well. So that's generally what number one is, meaning that we've got a toolkit of models. Depending on whether we have juvenile data or not all stocks can be modeled using juvenile data if it doesn't exist. So we just select the suite of models for each stock that could be explored, limited by the data that's available.
Okay. So for any given stock, you could run a variety of models on that stock if the data is available?
Yes, and we would.
Okay. So the next point is to perform a retrospective analysis for each stock. What is involved in that process?
For every stock, we have this toolkit of models that we can be used for that particular stock. And then the next step that we do to select the top model is to conduct retrospective analysis, and that is essentially taking the first half. So we have a 50-year stock recruitment time series for stocks. Generally speaking, they're not all the same length, but say generally 50 years. We break that time series in half and use the first half of the time series to seed the models, whether they're biological models or naive models. And then for the second half of the time series, we start to create a time series of forecasts. So we sequentially, for the second half of the time series, generate a forecast and then update that data point into the first half of the time series, and then for the next year generate a forecast. And we keep going through updating the data behind and generating forecasts. So we'll end up with a whole time series for the second half of the time series of forecasts. And we can compare those forecasts to the true returns. The models that have the smallest difference between the forecasts and the true returns perform better in retrospective analysis. So we look at the performance of the models and compare how each one is doing through time compared to the true return time series. And we create a ranking for all the candidate models for a particular stock. And then we're ranking them based on this retrospective analysis from 1 to total number of models that exist. So that's retrospective analysis for ranking. So we have the ranking for each stock of the suite of candidate models that we've used. And in the 2006 paper, what was done was the top ranked model in that ranked from the retrospective analysis is actually used for the forecasting for that annual forecast.
So that's the step 4. The best forecast model is that top rank model.
That top ranked model.
Okay.
And that was used for 2006.
Okay. In doing that work, have you found, or has the department found, that one model performs better than others across all stocks? Like, is there one ideal model that works for all the stocks better than anything else?
There is not one model that performs optimally across all stocks and even across one stock through time. So generally, if you look at a forecast table, there'll be a range of different models being used to generate forecasts for different stocks. And not one model comes out as being superior to any of the other models. And this is similar to results done by Dr. Randall Peterman's group in a paper by Hasseker in 2008. He's using the same methodology as the Department of Fisheries and Oceans is using to rank models and compare performance. So they're using the retrospective analysis approach we use as well. And in that paper, they, similarly to us, have not found a single model that outperforms all the other models. There's not one that rises to the surface as the ultimate forecast model. And in some cases, interestingly, both from our perspective and from Dr. Peterman's perspective, is that naive models can sometimes perform better than biological models. So there are cases where naive models that may just be a time series average performs better over time than a biological model that may include the brood year escapement and the relationship between brood year escapement and recruits. In a biological model, the naive models actually might perform better for certain stocks. So you'll see in the forecast tables, certain naive models for certain stocks have performed better.
Okay.
So, yes.
Sorry, I was just going to say, if we turn to page 11 of the document that you have in front of you, which is actually page number 15. This is just an example of all the different stocks that you talked about earlier with the different run timing groups, and then the forecast models that were determined to be the best for each of those stocks under the column forecast model. Is that correct?
That's correct. This is for the 2006 paper.
Right. And you can just see there's a wide range of, as you say, the Ricker model, which is a biological model on Bowron, compared to the TSA, which is a non-parametric model for fennel.
Right.
Okay. Have you looked at how environmental variables improve model performance? I know you have said that that does go into the biological model work. Have you found that it improves model performance?
We've looked at a variety of environmental variables that include sea surface temperature and Fraser discharge, ocean indices such as the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, that is really just tracking sea surface temperature anomalies in the broader North Pacific. So we've looked at a bunch of different variables, and although for some stocks in some retrospective analysis years, like in some years when we're conducting retrospective analysis, environmental variables can help improve the forecast performance. It's not a significant improvement in terms of the performance or in terms of the forecast you get. So generally, when you look at the forecast with just a Ricker model, just a biological model with no environmental variable, and then if you look at a Ricker with a sea surface temperature covariate that we've explored, even though the sea surface temperature covariate may slightly improve forecast performance, you won't see a huge difference between the forecasts. It's only slightly tweaking the forecasts, but it isn't having a large impact on the overall forecast. And there isn't one environmental variable, again, that performs best for all stocks. So basically, from a quantitative perspective, the environmental variables haven't significantly improved the forecast for all the variables we looked at. And likely that's because single environmental variables such as sea surface temperature or even the broad ocean indices are oversimplifying the complexity of the survival mechanisms in both the freshwater and the marine environment that's working together to influence total survival for Fraser sockeye. So using a single environmental variable quantitatively hasn't given us any answers in terms of making big differences to the forecast approach.
Okay, thank you. The LCAS paper preseason run size forecast for Fraser River sockeye for 2006 should be marked as the next exhibit, please.
Exhibit number 351.
Okay. And now, as I think we've already said, the method that we've just reviewed that's described in the 2006 paper was used in 2007, 2008, and 2009. Is that fair?
That's correct.
And once I take it there wasn't a CSAS document prepared in each of those years because there weren't significant changes made to the model. You were simply applying the model that was described in this paper?
There is, just to correct or to clarify that, there is a CSAS paper, and CSAS is the Canadian Science Advisory Secretariat report is produced annually, and it's a SAR.
Sorry, that's what I was going to get to, that there wasn't one of these research documents prepared in those 2007, 8, 9.
That's correct.
But there was a science advisory report prepared for each of those years, which produces the results of your model runs and your forecast for use in the department.
Yes.
Okay, so those have already been marked as exhibits in the hearing. The 2009 one is exhibit 340. This is the document that was prepared in the 2009 year by you and your group.
I should clarify, it is prepared by myself and my colleagues and my collaborators, but it is also the synthesis of the salmon subcommittee for the CSAP process, which is the Canadian Science Advice Pacific review process that DFO has to review papers annually. So the actual author of these science advisory reports is not myself, but it is the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, and it includes all the consensus from these meetings based on what we present, and it's a consensus from the committee on that is placed into this document. So the actual author is Fisheries and Oceans.
Okay, and that committee that you're referring to is the Salmon Subcommittee of the Center for Science Advice Pacific.
That's correct.
Okay. And that document is the document that's intended to be used for forecast information for the 2009 year.
That's correct.
Okay. And who uses this document?
This would be used both, by a range of users. It is placed on the Fisheries and Oceans, or on the CSAS, Canadian Science Advice Secretariat website. So once it's published, it's placed on the website, so it's available for public consumption. So anyone can use it for any purpose. In terms of formal processes, the information in the document is used formally by the Fraser panel process in the fisheries planning process. It's used internally. I guess it can just be used by anyone.
Okay. I'd like to move now to the changes that were made to the model in 2010. First of all, in 2010, there were changes made that were extensive enough that another research document was prepared. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. And that document should be at tab 4 of your binder, and the CAN reference, I think, is CAN 185610. I hope that's right. Okay, so this document was authored by you along with Catherine Michelson's from the Salmon Commission, E.J. Porst, I'm not sure where this person's from, and Mr. Alcass, or Dr. Alcass.
Yes, the authors are myself, Dr. Catherine Michelson's from the Pacific Salmon Commission, Aaron Porst from DFO, and Alcass from DFO.
Okay. And why was this document required in 2010? Why were changes made, and why did it go into this form of document?
We had presented a science advisory report through the normal course of action in November, as we typically do present them. And for the 2010 one, we presented at the CSAP process, and the Salmon Subcommittee had determined or assessed or concluded that there had been enough there were sufficient changes to the 2010 document that we were presenting as a science advisory report that it required a research document format. And the changes...
And what's the significance of it going to a research document format?
A research document is much more intense in terms of the analysis that goes into the report. It is, as you can see, this actually has authors that include myself and Dr. Catherine McKelsons and Porst and Cass, and so this is a research document, more detailed. It also is now going through a more formal review process. In addition to the salmon subcommittee, there are generally two formal reviewers placed on it. It's similar to, in some ways, a master's defense or a PhD defense or a publication in the primary literature where you're actually getting formal reviews for this. So the document gets sent to formal reviewers. In the case of this document, we had Dr. Randall Peterman from Simon Fraser University, as well as Dr. Chris Wood as formal reviewers. So in the case of a research document, it goes through that formal review process. Those reviewers provide comment as well on the day of the CSAP meeting. For example, Dr. Randall Peterman attended the CSAP proceedings and provided comments throughout that as well, in addition to his formal written comments. And as well, there's a salmon subcommittee present, typical of the science advisory reports as well, where all the people present, including internal and external to the department experts, technical experts on forecasting, as well as Fraser Sockeye, attend. And it's essentially a defense of the paper by the authors to the salmon subcommittee that also includes the two formal reviewers, and it includes internal and external. So it's a step up from the science advisory report in terms of the formality of the review process. And as I said, it's very similar to other review processes that involve master's, PhD, or publication, primary literature publication.
And was there something that, like, what happened to generate the need for this? Like, why were the changes made?
For Fraser Sockeye, we'd seen productivity declines for these stocks for some time. We'd been reporting on them even in these forecast documents starting in the 2006 paper, perhaps earlier. I just haven't scrutinized them to date, but they, for this meeting, so we'd been observing these declines in productivity. And in 2009, we also saw an extremely low productivity event, the lowest productivity we'd seen on record. But we'd still seen these persistent declines in productivity. So for the 2010 forecast, we wanted to present alternative hypotheses for future survival for Fraser Sockeye. Typically, we'd been using the long-term average, so the full time series to forecast returns, so the full stock recruit time series. And in the 2010 forecast, we wanted to present alternative assumptions about the survival of Fraser Sockeye in this paper in light of declines in productivity.
There's a series of pages where the declines are graphically presented, and I'm not going to spend any time on this. I just wanted to flag that's what these graphs are showing, the returns over time and the decline on some, but not all.
That's correct. There's most of the 19 core forecasted stocks have been exhibiting systematic declines in productivity. There are a few stocks such as Weaver, Late Shuswap, that have not been exhibiting systematic declines in productivity, as well as Harrison, in contrast, that has been exhibiting systematic increases in productivity.
Okay. All right, so you were faced in 2010 2009 with lowest returns ever, and that caused you to go and have a look at how you were putting assumptions into the model, or whether there was other assumptions that could be made to improve your forecasting outputs. Is that fair?
It was the declines that we'd seen systematically over time, and 2009 as well, that led to exploring the forecast methodology in a different way.
Okay. And what was the change that was made in the 2010? What was the new assumptions that were put in?
For the 2010 document, we included 3 different alternative assumptions about survival of Fraser sockeye. And that, when I say survival, includes from the egg stage all the way through to the adult return stage. So we included 3 different scenarios that reflect different assumptions about the survival experienced by fish returning in 2010, starting from when they were in the gravel all the way through to their adult return. The first productivity scenario that we included was long-term average productivity, and that methodology to produce that forecast table was identical to past methodology that has been used. So it's using the full time series in the context of forecasting to generate the forecasts. So there's nothing new with the recent, the long-term average first case productivity table. The differences in the forecasting methodology occurred in the second and third cases, which are the recent productivity forecast, which assumes that recent productivity is what we're using. It's the assumption that recent productivity is what's going to persist through to 2010 is the second assumption. And the third assumption, or this third forecast table, is if 2009, which was the lowest productivity on record for most of the Fraser sockeye stocks, if 2009 repeats itself, it is the forecast that we would expect, the return that we would expect to see in the third forecast is if 2009 productivity repeated itself through to 2010. The specific changes for the second forecast that I just mentioned, the recent productivity, I'll go through that because I'll go through the last 2 cases where the forecast specific methodologies changed. In the second case, the recent productivity forecast, the major changes in that were the inclusion of 3 new models. What we've called the RS 4-year, which is recruits per spawner in the last 4 years, the RS 8-year, which is the average recruits per spawner in the last 8 years, and the Coleman filter Ricker model. And these 3 models are they're using as predictor variables the brood year escapement, which what we use for Fraser sockeye is effective female spawner abundance, which is females multiplied by their spawner success. How successfully were they as spawners in terms of their percent spawn in terms of their eggs present in their carcasses. So that's what we're using as a predictor variable for the 3 new models. The RS 4-year is simply taking that brood year escapement and multiplying it by productivity in the last 4 years or the last 8 years. So RS 4-year, RS 8-year. The Coleman filter Ricker model is using the Ricker model form, but it's classically models use the full time series, and in the Ricker model there's a parameter for the productivity of a stock. And when you're using the full time series, that model is parameterized using the full time series. So from the high productivity period all the way down to the low productivity period. That's typically what's used, and if we used a Ricker model in the case 1 long-term average forecast, it would be using a productivity that reflects the full time series. What the Coleman filter Ricker model does is focus that productivity parameter on the more recent time series, which has been lower in terms of productivity. So typically, if stocks have been declining, the Coleman filter Ricker model will produce a lower forecast because it's picking up that lower productivity in a biological model context. And that model's based on work by Catherine McKelson's, as well as collaboration with Randall Peterman, Dr. Randall Peterman from SFU, who has published work on the Kalman filter Ricker model and describes the importance of using such models given in light of when you see shifts in productivity. So those would be the 3 new models that we've used in the second case, which is the recent productivity. They're models that specifically pick up recent productivity. Now, we still used all our full suite of candidate models for each stock. We just added these 3 new models, and we've run them through a retrospective analysis that I've described earlier to compare which models perform better. The other difference with that second case, which is the recent productivity forecast scenario, is that we look at the performance of all of these models over the recent time period, so in the last 8 years. So rather than taking the full retrospective period, which is the second half of the time series, we're only using the last 8 years because productivity has declined. We want to see if certain models are performing better more in the recent period. And so that would be a departure from the first case scenario where we're using the full retrospective time series to rank the models. The other difference between the second case and the first case, so the recent productivity versus a long-term average, is that 5-year-old recruits, typically when we're generating forecasts, we generate forecasts for the 4 and 5-year-old recruits, and then by assigning age proportions to those recruits, we add them together to get the total forecast. So typically for the long-term average productivity forecasts, we would just run the 2 recruitments through the model and get the recruitment at the and then do those calculations. In the case of the recent productivity, because the 5-year-olds in this, their Fraser sockeye are 4 and 5-year-old fish. So we're generating forecasts for 4 and 5-year-olds and adding them together because we expect 4 and 5-year-olds to return. In the case of the 5-year-olds, they would have been from the same adult spawners. They would have entered the ocean at the same time as the 4-year-olds that returned in 2009, so in the previous year. And we know for many of those stocks that previous year was the lowest survival on record for a number of the stocks, lowest productivity on record. So for the 5-year-old component, for the recent productivity forecasts, we used the preliminary productivity from the previous year, from 2009, knowing that these 5-year-olds experienced all the same survival conditions, so likely they will be equally coming back on similar productivities. We used preliminary productivity from 2009 to forecast the 5-year-old component of the total forecast. And what that means is essentially because it's the lowest productivity on record, it's even lower than the recent 4 years. If you're generating a forecast for the 5-year-olds, it'll be much lower, given it's the lowest we've ever seen on the Fraser sockeye record for most stocks. So there was a difference in that 5-year-old component as well for the recent productivity forecasts. Model selection was the same for recent productivity forecasts, where you would rank the models and select the top models to generate forecasts. And the final forecast scenario, the third one, was what if 2009 repeats itself? And so we say the same productivity we saw in 2009 repeating itself in 2010. What would we see in terms of returns? So that was the last scenario where we took preliminary productivity again from 2009 and we applied it to both the 4-year-olds and the 5-year-olds. So in case 2, we only used 2009 productivity for the 5-year-olds because we know they encountered the same survival conditions. But for the what if productivity in 2009 repeats itself, we just applied the productivity we saw in 2009 to generate forecasts for 2010 returns based on the Brugger escapements for 2010. So it's the assumption that if 2009 repeats itself, this is what we would see, and we presented it in the third forecast table.
With those 3 different case studies, as you've described them, you then went through the same forecasting exercise that you had done in the years previous, or as you've described as modified, but you created a forecast for each of the stocks for each of those cases. Is that right?
That's
Or
that's
run timing
correct.
groups, I guess, in some cases.
Yes, and there was one thing I wanted to elaborate on when you were referring to the 2006 methodology. One thing that we started to do differently is instead of just choosing the top ranked model to generate the forecast, we compare, because in the ranking process, it's an important thing to bring up because you're asking about changes. And one thing we layered on from the Cass et al. Paper, and this is a lot of from advice from other people and from different meetings, from a lot of input from the Pacific Salmon Commission. We compare the forecasts that are produced for not just the top model, but the top ranked models, and compare the actual forecasts being produced, because sometimes performance between the first ranked model and the second ranked model can be very small. So we want to see if the forecasts are telling us something different using a different model form. So we go through a whole process of evaluating how, for each stock, the top models
Okay.
forecast.
Okay, so you do the mathematical modeling and you come up with your best estimate of a forecast for each of the different 19 stocks in most cases, and or the run timing groups. I think the case 3 you only had run timing groups for. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, so without getting into that minutia for right now, that those forecasts were then presented in the 2010 research paper on page 41 in a graph or a figure that shows sort of the aggregated information put together using the different models. So we have, if you can turn to page 41, which is 47 in ringtail, I think. And it's not in color, but hopefully you can describe what's on that. So this document, as I understand it, the first graph, which says A, all stocks, puts all of the different run timing group aggregates together, and it shows the total run size forecasts using one, long-term average productivity, which is sort of the old method, and then 2, the recent productivity, which is case 2 that you just went through, and then 3, productivity equivalent to the 2005 brood year, which is the case 3 study that you described.
That's correct.
Okay. And then it's broken down below into each of the different run timing groups, that same function. So you've got the calculations done for the long-term average productivity, the old method, the case 2, and the case 3. Okay. So can you just explain, like, what's being shown on these bars? This is a probability distribution, I take it. Can you explain how that is to be read?
These are plots to graphically display the probability distributions of the forecast table, and it's communicating, this table is this figure is specifically communicating the random stochastic uncertainty in the forecast that deals with what I described earlier in terms of observation error, what's called variability in returns from one year to the next. So the width of that horizontal bar is describing the uncertainty from those two elements. And in addition, it's also, these figures are describing uncertainty in regards to your different assumptions regarding productivity for Fraser sockeye under the 3 different scenarios. So under the assumption that long-term average productivity will persist into 2010, whether recent productivity is going to persist through to 2010, or whether productivity equivalent to the 2005 brood year, which means productivity that we saw associated with the 2009 returns, which was the lowest on record, whether that will repeat itself through to 2010. So there are 3 alternative assumptions about what we might expect to see in terms of productivity for Fraser sockeye. So the width of those horizontal bars are describing,
So that,
just repeating myself.
okay. So just in lay people's terms, that if we look at the long-term average productivity, the first gray bar would show what, the 10% probability?
Yes, the left-hand component of all those bars, which is dark gray on the left-hand side of all the the graphs is the 10% probability level.
Okay, and then you move into the black bars, and there's a white separator at some point on that bar. Is that the 50% probability mark?
That's correct. So these are the probabilities extracted from the forecast table, and they're describing the probability of a return coming in at that return abundance or below. So the 25% probability level would be describing a probability of being at that run size. So there's a 1 in 4 chance that the return would come in at or below that specified run size. Okay. So you're right, Wendy, the white bar is the 50% probability level.
And the numbers on the x-axis, those are numbers of fish, right? Like the
total returns.
Total returns. Yes. Okay. So if we look at the long-term average productivity bar for 2010, you were predicting, I take it, if we take the gray bar right out to the right-hand margin, that there was a 90% chance that there was a 10% chance that the run would be 40 plus million or less. Is that how we read this?
A 90% probability that it would be at 41 million or less.
Okay. Oh, sorry, yes.
Yeah.
I don't know why I keep getting these
it's
probabilities reversed, but someday I'll get it. All right. And then the next line, recent productivity, there are some arrows pointing to the different dividers on this graph. Can you tell me why that is?
The arrows were communicating the exercise we just went through in identifying the break points between the 10, the 25, 50, 75, and 95% probability levels. And these probability levels are extracted from the actual 3 different tables. So it's those color breaks that are identical in terms of what probability level they're representing on the 3 different scenarios for your assumptions about productivity for Fraser sockeye.
Okay. And is there a reason why the case 2, recent productivity, is highlighted in that way, that the arrows are pointing to that bar and not one of the other 2 bars?
We were trying to select the easiest one to illustrate that example.
Okay. The 2010 return, did it actually come in within any of the forecasts that were produced for the 2010 year? The actual return for 2010, does it fall within any of these probabilities we see on the graphs?
It's very preliminary, the return results, so they haven't been finalized yet. But for 2010, the return, I think, was around 35 million. So it would fall within the probability distribution for the long-term average productivity scenario. But that is looking at the total.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it does.
Okay. I mean, the Commission has heard at public hearings that the 2010 forecast was inaccurate, and that caused various problems. Do you consider that the 2010 forecast was inaccurate based on the work that you did?
Well, I guess when you're looking at these probability distributions, they are describing the total distribution. The actual return if you break it down by stock, we don't have all the final details for all the stock breakdowns, but these probability distributions are describing I guess using the word inaccurate is probably not what I would describe it as. These forecasts are describing the range of uncertainty and our knowledge based on these different assumptions about future survival. And what the returns came back at, particularly for certain stocks, particularly late Shuswap and the early summer Shuswap group, came in on the higher end of the probability distribution. Other stocks came within the came in some cases below the 50% probability level for the long-term average, sometimes above. So there's lots of variability in productivity for the returns that we saw in 2010. So what these forecast scenarios are doing is placing those returns in the context of the different assumptions about future productivity and providing a measure of where those actual returns are falling out in regards to long-term, recent, or 2005 brood year productivity. So they were on the map in terms of long-term average productivity. So what the forecasts are telling us is that for a lot of stocks, the 2010 returns were well above average for the case of late Shuswap, but they're also telling us for some stocks, because you have to go through the complexity of all the stocks that exist, that some stocks were below average in terms of long-term average productivity. So we used the forecast as a sort of map to place the returns in the context of the different productivity scenarios.
Hearing will now recess for 15 minutes.